Greetings from Mission Control Houston, and welcome to this Friday's edition of International Space Station Update. Joining us here inside of the flight control room at the Johnson Space Center in Houston, Texas, Orbit 2 team currently on console, being led by that man right there walking, Flight Director Chris Edlin, and right behind him in the blue shirt, Capcom Clay Anderson, NASA astronaut who will serve as the communication link between the controllers down here on the ground and the astronauts up in space. Those astronauts right now, the crew of Expedition 33, being led by NASA astronaut Sonny Williams all the way on the left there. In the middle, Russian cosmonaut Yuri Malenchenko, veteran spaceflyer on his 5th space flight. And then all the way on the right, Japanese astronaut Aki Hoshide on his 2nd flight, a veteran of one previous shuttle mission. It's a very busy time for the astronauts up on orbit this week, seeing the arrival of a new cargo vehicle, taking up a good deal of their time throughout the week. Starting off on Monday, though, Expedition 33 Commander Sonny Williams was involved with some ultrasound scans for an ongoing experiment known as Sprint. These astronauts getting in about 2 hours of exercise every day in order to combat some of the negative effects of weightlessness. Sprint is an ongoing study to see if shorter exercise periods but at higher intensities can have a better effect at combating some of the negative effects of weightlessness. So she was taking some ultrasounds of her legs, being assisted by Aki Hoshide, and then transmitting all of that data down to researchers on the ground. Sonny also took some time to do a ham radio pass using standard ham radio equipment with the St. George International School in Luxembourg, getting a chance to talk to students and answer their questions directly from the International Space Station. She's also going through a conference with controllers down on the ground as they continue to prep for the arrival of the Dragon SpaceX capsule, which would arrive the following day. Also on Monday, Aki Hoshide was continuing his extended session of the ESA energy experiment. The energy experiment looking to further understand the direct relationship between nutrition and the effects of space on the astronauts' energy levels, also helping to further determine the energy requirements that are necessary for recommending healthy nutrition in these astronauts during their extended stay in weightlessness. Aki also working on the water recovery system on board the station. He's filling up one of the contingency water containers and also transferring some of the urine that is stored over to the urine processing assembly, which is then processed and then filtered back into potable drinking water for this Expedition 33 crew. Our 3rd crew member on board, Yuri Malenchenko, spent Monday doing some routine servicing of the Environmental Control and Life Support System, or ECLSS, over on the Russian segment inside of the Zvezda service module. He's also working with the Russian identification experiment, which looks to study different dynamic loads on the station structure, especially during dynamic events. And he was downloading some new structural dynamic measurements to the computer's readers. Moving on to Tuesday, Sonny Williams relocating a laptop for the upcoming capture of that Dragon spacecraft, which was scheduled to take place on Wednesday. She was relocating a few items over to the cupola where her and Aki Hoshide would be standing by the robotics controls. She also got the vestibule ready for fitting the airlock and the Harmony module where the Dragon would be arriving and docking, and also going over some cargo review procedures, going over some of the lists of high priority items that would need to be offloaded first off, and then any other cargo operations during a tag up with controllers down here on the ground. She was also doing some on-orbit training. The astronauts had access to a few simulators as they walked through the steps that would be necessary to capture the Dragon spacecraft with that station robotic arm, also known as Canadarm2, also going over some computer-based training on general vehicle operations to assist in her knowledge while the vehicle is docked to the station for about 18 days. Joining her in all of that onboard training was Aki Hoshide, who is side by side working in tandem with Sonny Williams on Wednesday. So on Tuesday he was going over the final rendezvous and capture simulations and also getting some vehicle operations training, again alongside with Sonny Williams. Aside from that, he was inside of the Japanese experiment module doing a pretty thorough analysis of the microbiological environment, He's using a device known as the SWAB ASD, or the Surface Water and Air Biocharacterization Air Sampling Device, just getting a readout of the general environment on a microscopic scale inside of that Japanese experiment module. Meanwhile, on Tuesday, Yuri Malenchenko, our Russian cosmonaut, immediately woke up and participated in the Sprut experiment, a Russian medical research project on the distribution and behavior of human body fluids in zero gravity. Since these astronauts are in that extended period of weightlessness for long periods of time, it doesn't have the same effect. No gravity pushing the majority of the body's fluids down towards the legs, so Sprut looks to track just how that affects the astronauts' performance once they're on orbit, and also how well they adapt to it. Regular gravity conditions following their arrival back down here on the surface. Aside from that, he was involved in the Russian Kolonovsky crystal experiment. He'd be working on this for about 3 days this week. A fairly complex physics experiment on board the station looking to study the dynamic and structural characteristics of crystal systems known as Coulomb crystals that are formed when ions are stored inside of an electromagnetic trap. Moving on to Wednesday, a very big day for the astronauts on board the station, seeing the arrival of the Dragon spacecraft. Sunny Williams started her day out moving the crew command panel into their position inside of the cupola that would be used for the crew, her and Aki, to interact with the Dragon capsule during its final approach. As it moved through a series of different stop and hold points, she would be monitoring the Dragon throughout its final approach, and then standing by to capture it with the space station robotic arm. This Dragon capsule, in the mission dubbed SpaceX CRS-1, or Commercial Resupply 1, is the first commercial resupply mission to the International Space Station. The capsule launched from the Cape Canaveral Air Force Station in Florida back on Sunday, about 7:35 p.m. Central Time. During its final fly up, you can see it here, parked just about 10 meters from its final home at the Harmony module on the Earth-facing side. Sunny Williams and Aki Hoshide manipulating that robotic arm to reach out and grapple with the SpaceX Dragon capsule. That was done successfully about 5:56 a.m. Central Time. Following that successful grapple, controllers down here in Mission Control maneuvered the Dragon spacecraft into its final docking attitude, and then once it was finally lined up, it was then the robotic arm was taken back over by Williams and Hoshide as they guided it in, berthing it with the Harmony module. That successful berthing coming at 8:03 a.m. Central Time. Following that berthing, the astronauts would go through and do a system of leak checks to make sure everything was latched in correctly and they had a good mate between the two spacecraft. Also going through and removing a number of the different components of the common berthing mechanism so they could get into the actual hatch opening. And again, Williams doing all of this on Wednesday. She was assisted throughout the day in handing off control of the robotic arm and some of the berthing operations with Aki Hoshide. But this Dragon spacecraft taking up pretty much their entire day on Wednesday. They were able to open up that hatch at about 12:40 p.m. Central Time, again on Wednesday. Moving on to Yuri Malenchenko, also on Wednesday, was working on a few more experiments on board the Russian segment. He spent a few hours working through the typologia experiment, which is an assessment of the mental state of these astronauts and also their prediction and correction quality. Basically just recording their ability to perform different tasks through a series of exercises, looking to track throughout their space flights any cognitive differences that they may experience. There's also back at working with that Kolonovsky crystal experiment for the second day in a row, and did a pre-pack of a Freon leak analyzer, which is scheduled to be returned down on the Dragon spacecraft, which will be bringing back down about 1,600 pounds of supplies once it departs the International Space Station a little bit later in November, or a little bit later this month. Moving on to Thursday, Sunny Williams working with the environmental health system on board the International Space Station, removing a buffer container from the total organic carbon analyzer, which is one of the items in that environmental health system that looks to track any potential contaminants in the astronauts' drinking water. She's also taking a few samples from the water processor assembly. Aside from that, she was unloading some cargo throughout the day from the SpaceX capsule, removing the double cold bag and also activating the newly arrived nanoracks experiment and transferring a few of the cold stowage items from the Dragon's glacier freezer over to one of the Merlin lockers on board the International Space Station. She also took some time out from her activities to speak with reporters from ABC News and CNN, giving them a look at life inside of the International Space Station. Meanwhile, Aki Hoshide spent much of his day on Thursday transferring cargo out from that newly arrived Dragon spacecraft. He was also swapping out one of the hard drives in the crystal liquids and crystallization experiment. But again, much of his day spent on Thursday inside of that Dragon capsule, removing some of the 800 some pounds of cargo that arrived on board the station, and then also prepping it for the installation of any items that'll be sent back down to the ground. Also on Thursday, Yuri Malenchenko continued his third day of that Kolonovsky crystal experiment, and also cleaned up a few ventilation screens and dust collectors over in the Russian segment, ensuring that the breathing atmosphere inside of the International Space Station is receiving the proper scrubbing of different potentially harmful particles. Just some of the routine maintenance that goes on part of these astronauts' day to ensure that their living environment in the orbiting laboratory is kept safe and healthy. All that brings us to today on Friday. Sonny Williams earlier in the morning doing an audit on one of the contingency water containers inside of the environmental health system on board the International Space Station. She'll also be spending much of today transferring some of the cargo from the station into the Dragon spacecraft. As mentioned, it'll be bringing down a total of 1,637 pounds of supplies once it returns back down to the Earth for a splashdown a few miles off the coast of California. Among this 1,600 pounds of supplies, over 800 will be scientific research specific, returning down a number of samples from many biological experiments being conducted on board station that had been stored in freezers. Since the retirement of the shuttle, no large downmass capability has been available to the crews on board the International Space Station. So this SpaceX capsule providing an invaluable link in the chain of continuing research and utilization of many of the biological, not only human, but also different plant and animal cell biology experiments going on board the International Space Station that require these samples to be returned down to researchers here on the ground. So Sonny transferring a bunch of cargo over into the Dragon spacecraft today. She also got a chance to speak with some reporters in her native Massachusetts from WBZ TV, again giving them a look inside of life on board the International Space Station and all the activities she's been up to during her increment as Expedition 33 commander. Meanwhile, Aki Hoshide back inside of the Japanese experiment module using a microbe air sampling device, collecting a few microbes. Again, continuing some of the activities that he started earlier this week, checking the environment inside of the module. This is a fairly routine practice for these astronauts as they continually track to see the environment of the entire station structure, even down to a microscopic level. Aside from doing that work inside the GEM, he'll also be pressurizing the experiment module's airlock, which leads directly out into the exposed facility and is used to transfer different experiments back and forth between the pressurized portion of the International Space Station and the unpressurized vacuum setting of that Japanese exposed facility. He'll also be doing some of his own ultrasounds, which Sonny Williams is doing a little bit earlier this week, all part of the Sprint research project on board the International Space Station. And our final crew member, Yuri Malenchenko, doing some routine replacements today, working on the Russian toilet system and also changing out a few dust filters throughout the air revitalization system over on the Russian segment. Also working today with the Matryoshka study. It's a radiation study named after the nested Russian dolls. He'll be removing a few of the dosimeters and downlinking any of the data retrieved from those to researchers down on the ground. Again, it's one of the radiation studies on board the International Space Station. It's a mannequin-sized object that has a number of readers spaced throughout it and looks to track any of the radiation levels during spaceflight that these astronauts are being exposed to. And aside from all the astronaut work, troubleshooting was occurring yesterday to reapply a few of the electrical loads on various components of the 3A power channel, and all that troubleshooting was completed. Engineers are going to monitor the power channel over the next 7 days to observe the performance of the system. An apparent short was noticed several weeks ago that took down the channel, but this reapplication of loads yesterday could mean that no spacewalk would be required to fix any of the issues outside of the station. And then, as of right now, the batteries on that 3A power channel are charged but aren't delivering any power to the systems at the moment until this 7-day monitoring period is over.